From a distance, they looked like the kind of couple people envied. Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka, young, clean-cut blonde. They looked good in photographs. He in a pressed shirt, arms crossed with confidence. She with soft curls and a polite smile. Together, they looked like an advertisement for something simple and safe. Something familiar. Maybe even something enviable. But that was the trick. The truth of Paul and Karla wasn't in the photos. It wasn't in the way they smiled at dinner parties or the stories they told about how they met. The truth lived elsewhere, in the small silences between them, the way she deferred, the way he stared just a second too long. It lived in what they hid, and how well they hid it. They met in 1987 in Scarborough, Ontario. Karla was 17. Paul was 23. He spotted her in a hotel restaurant. She was reading alone. Blonde hair, serious expression. She looked older than she was. He struck up a conversation. By the end of the evening, they had dinner together. By the end of the week, they were inseparable. To Karla, Paul seemed like everything she'd imagined, confident, handsome, older. He talked like he knew things. He made her laugh. He paid attention. And to Paul, Karla was easy to impress. She looked up to him. She listened. Their relationship moved fast. And from the outside, it looked like a fairy tale, the quiet girl and the charming man. They were attractive, social, and lived in the kind of suburban settings where things weren't supposed to go wrong. But things were already wrong. Long before they met, Paul had built a double life. By day, he studied business, worked sales jobs, played the role of the well-mannered young man with good teeth and expensive cologne. But at night, he became something else entirely. In Scarborough, a series of violent sexual assaults had begun years earlier. The attacker remained unidentified, careful, fast, and brutal. Police had a profile, but no name. They wouldn't learn it was Paul until much later. Back then, there were no signs Karla saw, or at least none she acted on. When Paul was cruel, she forgave him. When he pushed her boundaries, she adjusted. When he confessed things that made her uneasy, she leaned in closer. Friends noticed she was changing. She dressed differently. She lost weight. She followed Paul's rules without question. He called her his perfect girl. She wanted to keep it that way. They moved in together after a year. Karla dropped out of university. Paul became controlling, but always with charm. He knew how to disguise pressure as affection. And Karla, who had grown up in a family that valued appearances, understood how to keep things looking right, even when they weren't. In public, they were still picture perfect. At barbecues, they smiled. At holidays, they showed up with wine. In photos, they leaned into each other with ease. No one saw the patterns forming underneath. No one knew what Paul had begun to ask for behind closed doors, or what Karla had already agreed to. By 1990, they were engaged. Friends called them Canada's golden couple. There were jokes about how they looked like dolls. Perfect hair, perfect posture, perfect everything. People said they were like Ken and Barbie. No one imagined what was coming. Before he ever met Karla, Paul Bernardo had already perfected the mask. He was born in 1964 in Scarborough, a suburb of Toronto where the houses all looked like they had been printed from the same catalog. He was the youngest of three, raised in a family that from the outside seemed ordinary enough. But inside, things were off. His father had a history of abuse. There were allegations. Quiet ones, never fully dealt with. His mother was withdrawn, cold sometimes, and Paul learned early that being good-looking and agreeable could make things easier. He smiled a lot. He was polite. Teachers described him as neat, well-spoken, respectful. He never raised his voice in class. At home, he mostly kept to himself. By high school, he had grown into the kind of boy people noticed. Blonde, clean-cut, with the kind of confidence that passed for charisma. He liked rules, but only the ones he could control. He didn't drink, didn't smoke. He studied business and took pride in his ambition. He flirted with charm, but never overstepped. He understood the value of waiting, of building trust first. That was the surface. What lay beneath it didn't emerge all at once. It came slowly in layers, a growing fixation on power, submission, and control. His early relationships followed a pattern. At first, he was attentive, romantic even. He gave compliments. He opened doors. But as things progressed, his tone shifted. He became critical, possessive. He wanted obedience, not affection. And when he didn't get it, he changed. By his early 20s, Paul had learned how to split his life into halves. In one half, he was the charming young salesman, working in Toronto, wearing crisp shirts and shaking hands with clients. In the other, he roamed Scarborough's side streets and suburban paths under cover of night, stalking women walking alone. The attacks began in 1987, months before he met Karla. They were calculated, fast. He wore a hoodie, a disguise. He attacked from behind, then disappeared. The press began calling him the Scarborough rapist, though at the time no one knew who he was. The assaults followed a pattern, but the police struggled to identify a suspect. Paul didn't have a criminal record. He had never been arrested. He didn't fit the stereotype. He wasn't desperate, angry, or visibly unstable. He was good-looking, articulate, respectful in interviews, and that, as it turned out, helped him stay invisible. Victims gave similar descriptions. The attacks were violent, precise. There were over a dozen, possibly more. And still, Paul remained just outside suspicion. Even when DNA was collected and tested against potential suspects, the results took time, years in fact. Backlogs and delays meant that his sample sat in storage long after it could have changed everything. During the day, Paul joked with friends, went to meetings, complained about traffic. No one saw what he did at night. Then he met Karla. With her, he found something new, not just someone to manipulate, but someone who seemed willing to step into his world. She didn't flinch when he said dark things. She laughed when others might have pulled away. And slowly he tested her. He told her about the Scarborough rapist, not in confession, but in suggestion. Hints, scenarios. He called them fantasies. And Karla didn't run. She leaned in. Later, some would ask when she knew, when she truly understood who Paul was and what he had done. But the line was never clear. That was part of Paul's design. He didn't drop his mask. He handed it to others and asked them to hold it with him. By the time they moved in together, the assaults in Scarborough were continuing. At least one occurred while Karla was in the same home. But she didn't call police. She didn't ask questions. She said later that she was afraid, that he could be violent, controlling, and maybe that was true. But it was also true that she began helping him, in ways subtle at first, then impossible to deny. The man behind the smile had found someone who didn't want to run. He had found someone who, for reasons only she could fully understand, chose to stay. By the time they were engaged, Paul and Karla lived together in a modest house in St. Catharines, Ontario. The kind with vinyl siding, a small driveway, and a neatly trimmed lawn. Neighbors described them as polite, quiet. Nothing unusual. He worked odd jobs. She had a position at a local animal clinic. From the outside, their life looked settled, maybe even boring. But things inside the house were different. By then, Paul's control over Karla had deepened. What began as influence had become routine. He monitored how she dressed, how she spoke, who she saw. He decided what she was allowed to say. Karla had learned to adapt. Not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that made it easier not to resist. He still called her his perfect girl. She tried to stay perfect. What no one knew, not her parents, not her co-workers, not the people who smiled at her in the grocery store, was that Paul had begun to fixate on Karla's younger sister, Tammy. She was 15. At first, it was subtle. Paul made comments, observations. He joked about how pretty Tammy was becoming. He suggested that Karla help him train her, like a gift. A way to prove loyalty. Karla, at first, seemed to resist. But that resistance didn't last. The pressure Paul applied wasn't loud. It came in pieces, quiet, calculated, and constant. And soon, Karla stopped resisting at all. Tammy often visited their home. She liked spending time with her older sister. She trusted her. Paul was always around, smiling, helpful, the kind of man who parents liked because he knew how to perform respect. Karla's parents thought he was safe, charming, stable. What happened next wasn't spontaneous. It was planned. One night in December 1990, Karla stole animal-grade tranquilizers from her workplace. She mixed them with drinks. Paul brought a camera. Together, they waited. The goal, Paul said, was to give him something he had always wanted. Karla went along. Not passively, not reluctantly. She participated. Tammy never woke up. The official cause of death was ruled accidental, aspiration during sleep after drinking. There were burn marks on her face from a chemical used to clean up. The police noticed, but not enough. No one suspected anything beyond a tragic accident. The family was in shock. Karla cried. Paul stood by her side. They went to the funeral together. They carried the casket. People said they were strong. No one asked the right questions. And Paul understood what that meant. If they could get away with this, they could get away with more. After Tammy's death, something shifted. Not between Paul and Karla. That part had already changed. But in what they were willing to do, and how little guilt they seemed to feel. They continued their lives without interruption. Karla returned to work. Paul kept smiling. They attended family dinners as if nothing had happened. But behind closed doors, the control became more intense. Paul demanded more. Karla gave more. She had already crossed a line she could never return from. She knew what Paul was capable of. She had seen it, helped it, filmed it. And now, there was no one left who was watching closely. No one who suspected what they really were. No one who understood how far it would go. After Tammy's death, the world around Paul and Karla didn't crumble. It held steady. The funeral passed, condolences faded, and the calendar moved forward. Karla's parents, shattered by grief, leaned on her for support. They saw her pain and believed it. She was, after all, the older sister, the one left behind. And Paul stayed close, always helpful, always composed. But behind the surface, nothing was normal. Tammy's death hadn't created distance between them. It had done the opposite. It bound Paul and Karla together in something dark and irreversible. There were no secrets between them anymore, not the kind that mattered. Karla had seen what Paul wanted. She had given it to him. And now it was as if a threshold had been crossed. What they had done once, they could do again. It didn't happen right away. They took their time. There were months in between, during which they lived outwardly ordinary lives. Paul returned to his routines, controlling, watching, testing boundaries. Karla began to call in sick more often. Her demeanor changed. She looked thinner, tired, but still, she smiled when people asked if things were okay. By early 1991, Paul had become more reckless. He had lost his job. Money was tight. He started smuggling cigarettes over the U.S. border for cash. He had also become increasingly angry. At night, he went out, alone. Later, it would become clear that the attacks in Scarborough hadn't stopped. They had just moved west. Several women in the Niagara region reported being followed. Assaulted. The descriptions were similar. A man in his 20s. Blonde. Clean-cut. Calm. Still, no arrests were made. Inside the home, Paul's mood fluctuated. When things were calm, he was affectionate, or something that looked like it. When things shifted, he was violent. Karla knew this. She told no one. Whether out of fear, guilt, or loyalty, she kept quiet. She kept participating. Then came Leslie Mahaffey. She was 14 years old. Lived in Burlington, Ontario. One night in June 1991, she missed curfew and found herself locked out of the house. Paul saw her walking alone. It was late. He offered help. She accepted. What happened next was not spontaneous. It was deliberate. Paul brought her home. Karla was there. They had already talked about this. It wasn't framed as violence. Not out loud. It was presented as a game. Something shared. Something controlled. The house was quiet. The windows were closed. They filmed her. They kept her overnight. And by morning she was gone. Her body was later discovered encased in concrete blocks at a nearby lake. The investigation was immediate, but Paul and Karla were never mentioned. Not yet. They weren't on anyone's radar. There were no witnesses. No clear suspects. No one imagined the young couple living quietly in the suburbs, planning their wedding, could be connected to what had happened to Leslie. But something was changing. For the first time, the violence had left their home and touched the world outside. For the first time, someone else had seen what Paul was capable of and had not lived to tell it. And still Paul and Karla carried on. They planned their wedding. It was set for June 29, 1991, just 2 weeks after Leslie's body had been found. The timing shocked many later, once the truth emerged. But at the time, no one knew. The ceremony was held in Niagara-on-the-Lake, at a picturesque church. Karla wore white. Paul stood at the altar, smiling. There were flowers, music, posed photographs. Guests described the day as beautiful, peaceful, perfect. No one spoke of Leslie. No one asked where Paul had been 2 weeks earlier, or what the couple had been doing at night. No one thought to connect a missing teenager with two people who looked exactly how they were supposed to. And Paul knew that was his greatest advantage. People believed what they saw, and no one saw them for what they were. Not yet. On June 29, 1991, Paul, Bernardo and Karla Homolka stood before friends and family and exchanged vows. He wore a tuxedo. She wore white satin and lace. The ceremony was formal. The photos were glossy. Everything looked exactly as it should. Two young people starting a life together, with every detail planned and every moment preserved. What no one knew was that, on the morning of their wedding, police divers were still searching Lake Gibson, where pieces of Leslie Mahaffey had been found just 2 weeks earlier. While Karla walked down the aisle, while guests took photos, while Paul smiled for the camera, the case was unfolding a few miles away, a crime scene masked by celebration. But there were no signs of worry that day. No slip in behavior. No hesitation. Paul and Karla looked composed, happy, convincing. And once the ceremony was over, the mask never slipped. They went on a honeymoon. They came home. And not long after, they began preparing again. By late 1991, Paul was under pressure. The police investigation into the Scarborough assaults had begun to take shape, though his name wasn't yet confirmed. The backlog in DNA testing still slowed everything. But he knew it was closing in. His behavior became more erratic, more controlling. He wanted another victim. And Karla didn't try to stop him. If anything, she participated even more directly than before. In April 1992, Paul and Karla noticed a girl walking alone in St. Catharines. She was young, brown hair, wearing a school uniform. Her name was Kristen French, and she was 17 years old. Paul pulled over and pretended to ask for directions. Karla held a map. They smiled. They looked safe. Kristen didn't resist at first. She didn't see danger. Until it was too late. They brought her home. The same house where they had lived together as husband and wife. The same house with wedding photos on the walls and neighbors who waved from their porches. What happened inside over the next 3 days would later be revealed in court, and would shock even seasoned detectives. But in public, none of that was visible. Paul left the house for groceries. Karla walked the dog. Their lives outwardly looked normal. Kristen never made it home. When her parents reported her missing, the community responded immediately. Police searched fields, questioned friends, posted flyers. But Paul and Karla were never suspects. They didn't stand out. There was no reason to look their way. A few weeks later, Kristen's body was found in a ditch. There were signs she had resisted, fought back. She had been kept for days. Police began to realize that this case, and Leslie's, might be connected. Still, Paul and Karla carried on. They moved house, switched routines, smiled at neighbors, hosted guests. Karla returned to work for a while, but her demeanor had changed. She looked thinner again, pale, withdrawn. Some coworkers noticed, but no one asked too much. When they did, she said she was just tired. Married life, she joked. In reality, the violence inside the home had started to turn inward. Paul had always been controlling, but now he was also volatile. He accused Karla of disobedience. He blamed her for problems with the police. He hit her, frequently. One night in early 1993, he beat her so severely that she was admitted to the hospital with black eyes, a broken rib, and visible bruises. She told doctors she had been hit by a lamp. Her parents saw her face and were horrified. They took her in immediately. She stayed with them. It was the first time she stepped away. and while she recovered, Paul stayed in their home, unaware that the fragile trust between them had finally started to crack. In those quiet weeks, something shifted. Karla didn't go to the police right away. Not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't covering for him. She wasn't defending his name. She wasn't returning his calls. And in that silence, Paul was suddenly alone. He didn't know that Karla had begun to talk. In January 1993, Karla Homolka was admitted to the hospital with visible injuries, bruising to her face, broken ribs, and a fractured eye socket. She told doctors she had been hit with a lamp. Her family did not accept the explanation. They recognized the injuries for what they were and took her into their home. It was the first time she physically removed herself from Paul Bernardo. Around the same time, an earlier development in a separate investigation reached a turning point. In 1990, Paul had voluntarily submitted a DNA sample to police during the investigation into the Scarborough rapes. Due to a backlog in testing, the sample had remained unprocessed for nearly 3 years. In February 1993, the results were completed. Paul Bernardo's DNA matched multiple assaults attributed to the unidentified attacker, known as the Scarborough rapist. On February 17, 1993, police executed a search warrant at Paul Bernardo's home in St. Catharines. The warrant was narrow in scope and allowed investigators to search for specific items. They did not seize videotapes or hidden recordings, as they were not explicitly listed. Karla was no longer living in the house at that time. Shortly after the search, Karla agreed to speak with police. Her initial statements were vague. Soon after, she returned, this time accompanied by a lawyer, and agreed to a formal interview. In that interview, she identified Paul as the man responsible for the rapes in Scarborough and the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. She also disclosed her involvement in the drugging of her sister, Tammy Homolka, who had died in the Bernardo home in 1990. Karla stated that she had participated under duress. She described Paul as violent, controlling, and physically abusive. She presented herself as a victim who had been manipulated into submission. However, as the interviews progressed, her own role became more difficult to reconcile with fear alone. In several cases, her actions appeared coordinated, intentional, and voluntary. At this point, the Crown had no forensic evidence to support her claims. The videotapes, which would later become central to the case, had not yet been located. Karla was the only living witness to Paul's actions inside the home. Based on her cooperation, the Crown agreed to a plea bargain. In exchange for full testimony and a signed statement detailing the crimes, she would receive 12 years in prison for her role in the deaths of Mahaffey and French. The charges were reduced to manslaughter. In May 1993, Paul Bernardo was arrested and charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, kidnapping, and murder. The prosecution now had a cooperating witness, but the case against him was not yet complete. Police had statements and timelines. What they lacked was independent, physical confirmation of what had taken place inside that house. That evidence would come later, when they recovered the videotapes hidden in Paul and Karla's bedroom. During the initial search of Paul Bernardo's home in February 1993, police had followed the conditions of their warrant precisely. They examined rooms, collected specific items, but missed what would later become the most important evidence in the case. A set of videotapes recorded by Paul and Karla, documenting the assaults and murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. The tapes weren't hidden in an obscure place. They were located in the couple's shared bedroom, behind a light fixture in the bathroom. At the time of the search, the officers had no legal grounds to dismantle permanent fixtures. That limitation allowed the tapes to remain undiscovered, for now. Paul knew they existed. Karla knew too. After his arrest in May 1993, Bernardo was held in custody. Over the following weeks, he spoke privately with his defense lawyer, Ken Murray. During one of those meetings, Paul disclosed the existence and location of the tapes. Rather than immediately turning them over to police, Murray retrieved the tapes himself and kept them locked in his law office for more than 17 months. He did not inform investigators. He did not tell the Crown. He reviewed the tapes privately. Later, this decision would become the subject of a disciplinary hearing. At the time, it meant that the prosecution continued building their case without access to the one piece of evidence that could independently confirm or contradict Karla's statements. When the tapes were finally turned over to the Crown in September 1994, the reaction was immediate. What they revealed contradicted much of what Karla had claimed in her version of events. The tapes showed not only Paul committing acts of extreme violence and degradation, they also showed Karla participating, not under visible duress, not being coerced. Her behavior was calm, engaged, and active. In several scenes, she is heard directing Paul. In others, she is seen initiating or assisting. She is not a passive presence. Her role in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French was significantly more direct than she had previously stated. But by the time the tapes were reviewed, her plea deal was already signed. It could not be revoked. She had already agreed to testify against Paul. She had already received her sentence. Prosecutors described the situation as a deal with the devil. In hindsight, they acknowledged that, had they seen the tapes earlier, they never would have offered a reduced charge. But under the law, the agreement held. Karla would serve 12 years, no more. When the public learned what was on the tapes, the response was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. Until that point, Karla had been portrayed in the media as a battered wife who had been dragged into Paul's crimes. But once the nature of the footage became public knowledge, even in description, as the tapes themselves were sealed by the court, the perception shifted. Karla was no longer seen as a victim. She was seen as a participant, and for many Canadians it felt as though justice had failed. Protests were held outside the court. Editorials accused the Crown of incompetence. Politicians were asked why plea agreements were made without full access to evidence. Public trust in the case eroded. Meanwhile, Paul was transferred to Kingston Penitentiary to await trial. He was now facing 2 first-degree murder charges, with videotaped evidence confirming his actions. His legal team began preparing a defense. Their approach would center on minimizing his responsibility and shifting focus toward Karla, suggesting that her role had been more significant than acknowledged. But the tapes had already made the prosecution's case clear. What they showed removed any remaining doubt about Paul Bernardo's actions. What remained was the trial itself, a lengthy, high-security process that would be one of the most followed in Canadian history. Paul Bernardo's trial began in May 1995, more than 2 years after his arrest. It was held in Toronto rather than St. Catharines due to the intense public interest and the risk of jury bias in the community where the crimes had occurred. The courtroom was placed under strict security, and access was tightly controlled. A publication ban restricted media from reporting many details until after the proceedings had ended, but it was already one of the most closely followed trials in Canadian legal history. Bernardo faced 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, along with charges of kidnapping, unlawful confinement, aggravated sexual assault, and interference with a human body. He had previously been linked to more than a dozen rapes in the Scarborough area, but the focus now was on the murders. The prosecution's case was built around multiple layers of evidence. The videotapes recorded inside the Bernardo home, showing both Mahaffey and French being held, assaulted, and degraded over multiple days. Karla Homolka's testimony, now controversial but legally binding under her plea agreement. Forensic evidence, including the concrete blocks used to conceal Mahaffey's body and items recovered from the crime scenes. Statements Paul had made to various people, including his own lawyer, about the nature of his relationship with Karla and the extent of their involvement. The tapes were not shown publicly. Only the jury, the judge, the legal teams, and a few court officers were permitted to view them. Their contents were described in court in exacting detail, enough to remove any doubt about the severity of the crimes. Karla testified under oath. She answered questions about how the victims were lured, how they were restrained, and how long they were held. She admitted to participating in the abuse. She maintained that she had been manipulated, coerced, and afraid. Her demeanor in court was composed. She did not show emotion. The prosecution had no choice but to rely on her account, even though her credibility had been damaged by the release of the tapes. The defense did not dispute that Paul had committed the assaults. Their strategy was to claim that Karla had been more involved than acknowledged, and that she had struck a deal to protect herself from full accountability. They argued that her cooperation with the Crown was self-serving, and that her version of events could not be trusted. But the tapes undermined that strategy. They showed Paul initiating, orchestrating, and escalating the violence. They captured the pattern of control, degradation, and repetition that characterized both murders. The jury saw enough to form a clear picture of who Paul Bernardo was, with or without Karla. The trial lasted for nearly 4 months. In September 1995, the jury found Paul Bernardo guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum allowed under Canadian law. The judge designated him as a dangerous offender, a classification reserved for individuals deemed likely to reoffend and subject to indefinite detention. That designation effectively eliminated any realistic chance of release. Even if Bernardo one day became technically eligible for parole, the dangerous offender status meant he would almost certainly remain in prison for life. He was transferred to Kingston Penitentiary, then later moved to Millhaven Institution, and eventually to other high-security facilities. He was kept under near-constant surveillance and isolated from the general prison population for his own safety. Other inmates viewed him with contempt, not only for the crimes themselves, but for the calculated and prolonged cruelty behind them. Outside the courtroom, the response was grim but unsurprised. The guilty verdict had been widely expected. Still, for many in Canada, it brought only partial closure. The trial had confirmed the scope of Bernardo's crimes. But it had also solidified something else: that Karla Homolka, a full participant in many of the same acts, had received only a 12-year sentence and would one day walk free. That knowledge left the public unsettled. Justice, for many, had been only partly served. When the verdict came in, there was no relief. Paul Bernardo had been sentenced to life in prison with no realistic chance of release, but the public didn't respond with closure. There was no sense that justice had been evenly delivered. What settled over the country instead was a quiet, heavy discomfort, the kind that follows a verdict that answers some questions while raising others. People had accepted, by then, what Bernardo was. His crimes were documented in court, described in detail, and no longer deniable. The tapes had confirmed the worst. But what stood out more in the aftermath wasn't only what he had done. It was what Karla Homolka had done, and what she would not be punished for. The public didn't know the full extent of Karla's involvement until after the trial. Her plea deal had been signed in 1993, when prosecutors were working from her testimony alone. At the time, there was no physical evidence, no independent confirmation of what she claimed. Once the tapes were recovered and reviewed, they revealed something else entirely. Her behavior on camera was calm, measured, participatory. In several scenes, she gave instructions. She didn't appear coerced. She didn't appear afraid. By the time this became clear, her 12-year sentence had already been finalized. There was no legal mechanism to reverse it. The agreement stood. The reaction in Canada was immediate and intense. For many, the deal felt like a betrayal. The justice system had protected her, believing she was a victim. But the evidence suggested something different. A person who had willingly taken part in acts of cruelty and who had negotiated her way into a lighter sentence before the state understood who she truly was. Families of the victims expressed their outrage in carefully chosen words. They didn't sensationalize. They didn't scream. But they made it clear that 12 years was not enough. Not for what Karla had done. Not for what she had watched happen. And not for the silence she had kept until it benefited her to speak. Karla's public image, once sympathetic, collapsed. The media, which had initially portrayed her as a battered woman trapped in a violent relationship, now shifted tone. She was no longer seen as someone who had been manipulated. She was seen as someone who had known what she was doing, and who had made herself useful to the prosecution before they had all the facts. The term "deal with the devil" appeared in headlines and editorials. It wasn't just about the legal outcome. It was about trust in prosecutors, in the courts, in the process that was supposed to weigh responsibility and protect the public. There was no legal precedent for what happened. The tapes couldn't be unseen, and the deal couldn't be undone. Karla served her time under conditions that were, by Canadian standards, relatively comfortable. She had access to education, counseling, and temporary work release near the end of her sentence. The victims' families watched this unfold, knowing their daughters were gone and would not return. Karla, by contrast, had a release date. Even after the verdict, the case didn't fade from public view. It remained part of national conversation, in schools, in law classes, in journalism. It raised questions about how plea bargains are negotiated, how abuser-victim dynamics are evaluated, and whether the justice system was prepared to deal with complicity that doesn't fit clean categories. What had seemed for a moment like a successful conviction had become something else, a point of fracture. Not because the wrong man was punished, but because the wrong woman was spared. Karla Homolka served her 12-year sentence in Canadian federal prison, first at Kingston's Prison for Women, then later at Joliet Institution in Quebec. Her incarceration officially began in 1993, the same year she signed the plea agreement. From the beginning, her time inside was closely monitored by the media. She was not treated like an ordinary inmate, and she knew it. Within the system, Karla was compliant. She followed rules, participated in therapy programs, and enrolled in university courses. In reports, correctional staff described her as low risk. She caused no disruptions. Her academic progress and behavior were used as markers of rehabilitation. There were no formal incidents recorded against her during her time in custody. By Canadian law, she became eligible for full release after serving 2/3 of her sentence. There was no parole board hearing required. She had not been designated a dangerous offender, and the charges against her, manslaughter, not murder, did not qualify for extended restrictions. The system had no legal means to hold her past her statutory release date. On July 4, 2005, Karla Homolka was released from prison. Her release reignited the anger that had never really gone away. News crews waited outside the gates. The public remembered what the tapes had shown. They remembered the families of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. And they remembered the feeling of betrayal, not just at her actions, but at the fact that she would one day walk free. Karla gave one interview shortly before her release, through her lawyer. She said she accepted responsibility. She said she regretted what had happened, but she did not elaborate. She did not explain. She maintained that she had been under Paul Bernardo's control, even though the tapes suggested something more complex. In the months after her release, Karla relocated to Quebec under a different name. At the time, Canada had no laws allowing for post-sentence restrictions on her movement, employment, or associations. Journalists and members of the public raised concerns about whether she could be around children. There were no clear legal answers. The crimes she had committed were well known, but her sentence had been served in full. She was legally a free citizen. Several media outlets tracked her movements. At one point, she was living near a school. Later, reports surfaced that she had changed her name again, moved towns, and entered a new relationship. Over the years, it became known that she had married and had children. None of this violated the law. But each time a new article appeared, each time a photo circulated, the response was the same: confusion, outrage, disbelief. People wanted to know how someone could return to a normal life after what she had done. And if she could, what that said about the system that had allowed it. Karla did not reoffend. She stayed out of the spotlight. But even in silence, her presence in the world created tension. The idea that someone so publicly associated with such violent crimes could re-enter society, build a new family, and fade into relative anonymity was difficult for many to accept. Victims' families made no public gestures during this period. They had already said what needed to be said. What they wanted was quiet and memory. What they got was headlines. In interviews years later, members of the public who had followed the case closely said they never forgot her name. not because of who she had been, but because of what she had seen and what she had chosen to do. Her release marked a legal conclusion, but it did not bring closure. It reopened a question that had never been fully answered: whether serving a sentence, even in full, could ever truly balance the weight of what had been done. Paul Bernardo entered prison in 1995 as one of the most notorious inmates in Canadian history. His sentence was life without parole eligibility for 25 years. But with his designation as a dangerous offender, the meaning of that sentence was clear from the beginning. He would not be released. He was initially placed at Kingston Penitentiary, a maximum security facility where high-profile inmates were held under strict management. From the outset, he was kept in protective custody, isolated from the general population for his own safety. Other prisoners viewed him with contempt, not just for the nature of his crimes, but for the deliberate, methodical cruelty behind them. Even inside prison, Bernardo was seen as different. He had a calculated calmness that correctional officers noted early on. He followed institutional rules. He read extensively. He remained composed. But he never expressed remorse, and he never took full responsibility for what he had done. In psychological assessments, he was described as manipulative, self-serving, and emotionally detached. Over the years, he filed complaints. He wrote grievances about his living conditions, the lack of access to certain items, the limits placed on his movement. He argued that his isolation was inhumane. The institutions disagreed. Every request to be transferred out of segregation or placed in a less restrictive unit was denied. In 2013, Kingston Penitentiary was closed. Bernardo was moved to Millhaven Institution, another maximum security facility. There, he remained in isolation. His cell was monitored. His communications were restricted. Any contact with other inmates was carefully controlled. His crimes were never forgotten by the public, and they were never far from national attention. Every few years, his name would return to the headlines, not because of new actions, but because of the slow, mechanical passage of legal time. In 2018, he became eligible to apply for parole. Legally, this was a formality. His dangerous offender status meant that parole was not realistic. But under Canadian law, he still had the right to be heard. A hearing was scheduled. Victims' families were notified. When he appeared before the Parole Board of Canada, the decision was swift. The panel found no evidence of rehabilitation, no credible sign of remorse, and no reason to believe that Bernardo could safely re-enter society. His request was denied. In 2021, he applied again. The result was the same. His hearing lasted less than an hour. The board found his presentation superficial and his answers rehearsed. Again, he was denied any form of conditional release. Each time these hearings occurred, the public responded with renewed anger. Not because they believed he might be released, but because the idea that he could ask for it felt unacceptable. Victims' families described the process as painful, repetitive, and unnecessary. They knew the outcome would not change. Still, they were required to submit statements, appear if they wished, and relive the details each time his name appeared on the docket. Over the decades, Bernardo became more than a criminal. He became a fixed point in the Canadian memory of violence, a symbol of premeditated harm that was neither random nor impulsive, but sustained and coordinated over time. That, more than anything, is what separated him from many other offenders. His crimes were not the result of chaos. They were structured, planned, filmed. In prison, he remains confined. His cell is equipped with constant surveillance. His behavior is monitored. He is not allowed unsupervised interaction with staff or inmates. There is no expectation of change. As of 2025, Paul Bernardo is still incarcerated. He remains under the same conditions. He remains a dangerous offender. And he remains, in the eyes of the public and the justice system, a man who cannot be released. Not now, not ever.